Welcome, dear listener, to Candlelight Mysteries, where every whisper hides a truth and every shadow conceals a secret. Tonight, we draw back the curtains on a tale of elegance and envy, of old friendships and newer, darker intentions. We journey to the heart of the Cotswolds, to a grand estate called Maplewood Manor, where ivy clings to ancient stone and the past refuses to stay buried. Our story, Murder at Maplewood Manor, begins with a letter, a simple, genteel invitation that carries with it a plea for help, and the faintest echo of fear. At the center of our tale stands Miss Jane Marple, that most unassuming of detectives, whose keen observation and deep understanding of human nature have unraveled more than one tangled skein of deceit. She arrives at Maplewood not as an investigator, but as a guest, summoned by an old school friend who speaks of troubling thefts and uneasy nights. Yet, as Miss Marple well knows, beneath the surface of polite society, beneath the tea and pleasantries, the laughter and the light, often lies a darkness waiting to be named. In this household, secrets are currency and motives simmer just below the threshold of civility. A much younger husband, a resentful stepson, a dependent cousin, a lovelorn doctor, a foreigner with too many questions. Each harbors their own desires, their own wounds, their own capacity for betrayal. And when theft gives way to murder, when a woman's dying gasp shatters the manor's fragile peace, it will be Miss Marple, patient, perceptive, and relentless in her quiet way, who must sift truth from lies, innocence from guilt. So settle in, dear listener, pour yourself a cup of tea, and let the candles' glow illuminate the shadows. For in this world of whispered accusations and hidden letters, nothing is quite as it seems, and only the sharpest eye can see where danger truly lies. And now, dear listener, we turn to Chapter 1, where our mystery properly begins. Chapter 1, The Invitation from the Past. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipping through Miss Marple's letterbox in St. Mary Mead with the quiet inevitability of fate itself. It was written on thick, cream-colored paper, the kind one associated with country estates and old money. And the handwriting, though elegant, betrayed a certain tremor, a hesitancy that Miss Marple noted at once. The signature belonged to Lavinia Ashford, a name that carried Miss Marple back across the decades to a schoolroom in Bath, where two young girls had shared secrets and sticky buns and dreams of futures yet unwritten. Lavinia had married well the first time, to a gentle, scholarly man named Edmund Ashford, and had lived quietly at Maplewood Manor, raising a stepson and tending her roses. Miss Marple had heard through the grapevine of old acquaintances that Edmund had died some 5 years prior, suddenly, of a heart condition, and that Lavinia had remarried within 2 years, this time to a man considerably younger than herself. The letter mentioned none of this directly, but its tone suggested a household not entirely at ease. "Dearest Jane," it began, "how many years have passed since we last spoke? Too many, I confess, and the fault is entirely mine. I have thought of you often, particularly of late, for I find myself in need of a friend, someone whose judgment I trust above all others. Might you spare a fortnight to visit me at Maplewood? I should so love to see you again, and there are troubling occurrences here that I should like to discuss. Nothing dire, I hope, but unsettling nonetheless. Do say you will come. Yours ever, Lavinia." Miss Marple had read the letter twice, her blue eyes thoughtful. Troubling occurrences was a deliberately vague phrase, the sort one used when one did not wish to commit details to paper. It suggested secrecy, perhaps even fear. And Lavinia had always been forthright, even as a girl. Her reticence now spoke volumes. Miss Marple had penned a reply at once, accepting the invitation, and within a week found herself aboard a train bound for the Cotswolds. Her knitting bag on her lap, and her mind already turning over the puzzle Lavinia had set before her. The village nearest to Maplewood was called Lower Thornley, a sleepy hamlet of honey-colored stone cottages and a single inn. A car had been sent to collect her, driven by a taciturn young man who offered no conversation beyond a polite greeting. The drive wound through rolling hills and hedgerows, thick with late summer blooms, and then, quite suddenly, the manor came into view. Maplewood was everything Miss Marple had imagined, and more. It was an Elizabethan gem, all gabled roofs and mullioned windows, with ivy climbing its walls like a lover's embrace. The gardens stretched out in every direction, a riot of color and scent, and the ancient oaks that lined the drive seemed to stand as sentinels, guarding secrets centuries old. Yet, for all its beauty, there was something in the air, a stillness, a watchfulness, that made Miss Marple's instincts prickle. Lavinia met her at the door, and the years fell away in an instant. She was still beautiful, though her face bore the lines of care and grief, and her smile, while warm, did not quite reach her eyes. They embraced, and Lavinia's hands, Miss Marple noted, were cold despite the warmth of the day. "Jane, my dear, how wonderful to see you," Lavinia said, her voice bright and brittle. Come in, come in. You must be exhausted from your journey. We'll have tea, and you shall meet everyone." The entrance hall was grand, its walls lined with portraits of Ashford's past, their painted eyes seeming to follow Miss Marple as she passed. A sweeping staircase curved upward to the floors above, and the scent of beeswax and old wood hung in the air. Lavinia led her into a drawing-room decorated in shades of blue and gold, where a tea service had been laid out with meticulous care. "Mrs. Brennan, my housekeeper, sees to everything," Lavinia explained, pouring tea with hands that trembled ever so slightly. "I don't know what I should do without her. She was devoted to Edmund, and has been a rock to me since." Miss Marple accepted her cup and settled into a wing-back chair, her gaze taking in every detail of the room. The furnishings were fine but worn, suggesting old wealth rather than new. A fire crackled in the hearth despite the season, as though Lavinia sought warmth that the day could not provide. And there, on the mantelpiece, stood a photograph of a handsome silver-haired man, Edmund no doubt, and beside it a more recent portrait of a younger man with dark hair and a practiced smile. "Gerald," Miss Marple presumed. "Tell me, Lavinia," Miss Marple said gently, "about these troubling occurrences you mentioned." Lavinia set down her cup, her composure wavering. "It sounds so foolish when I say it aloud, Jane. Small things, you understand. Jewelry that goes missing and then reappears. Letters I'm certain I locked away, found disturbed. A sense that someone has been in my rooms when I am not there. My maid Bessie swears she has seen nothing, and Gerald, my husband, insists I am imagining things. But I am not, Jane. I am not." Her voice had risen, and she pressed a hand to her mouth as if to stifle the words. Miss Marple leaned forward, her expression calm and reassuring. "I have never known you to be fanciful, Lavinia," she said. "If you feel something is amiss, then it very likely is. Who else is in the house?" Lavinia took a steadying breath. "Well, there is Gerald, of course. We married 3 years ago. He is very kind to me, though I know there are those who think he married me for my money." She spoke the words with a defiance that suggested she had heard the gossip and chose not to believe it. "Then there is Philip, Edmund's son by his first marriage. He lives here still, though he and I have never been close. He resented me from the start, I'm afraid. Mrs. Brennan, as I mentioned, and Bessie, my maid. Old Tom, the gardener, he's been here since Edmund's father's time. And just now we have guests, my cousin Clara Finch, a dear girl who has had some financial difficulties, Dr. Hargrave, an old family friend, and Mr. Dunley, an American gentleman with an interest in art. They arrived last week for a fortnight's stay." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she absorbed this information. "A household of tangled relationships and hidden tensions. How very familiar. And do you suspect anyone in particular?" she asked. Lavinia hesitated, then shook her head. "I cannot bring myself to, Jane. They are all here under my roof. I cannot believe any of them would wish me harm. And yet you are afraid," Miss Marple finished softly. Lavinia's eyes filled with tears. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I am." At that moment the drawing-room door opened, and a man entered, tall, dark-haired, impeccably dressed with the kind of easy charm that Miss Marple had learned to distrust on sight. This, then, was Gerald Ashford. "Ah, my dear, is this your school friend?" he said, crossing the room with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "How delightful. I am Gerald, Lavinia's husband. You must be Miss Marple. My wife has spoken of you with great affection." Miss Marple inclined her head. "How do you do, Mr. Ashford?" His handshake was firm, but his gaze was assessing, as though he were calculating her worth and finding it negligible. "I do hope you will enjoy your stay at Maplewood, Miss Marple. It is a house of great history and great peace. My wife, I fear, has been overwrought of late. But I am certain your presence will do her a world of good." The words were perfectly courteous, yet they carried an edge, a dismissal of Lavinia's concerns that set Miss Marple's instincts on high alert. She smiled mildly and said nothing, and Gerald, after a moment, excused himself and left the room. Lavinia released a breath she had been holding. "You see," she said quietly. "He thinks I am imagining things." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her expression serene. "Perhaps," she said. "Or perhaps, my dear, he simply wishes you to think so." The afternoon wore on, and Miss Marple was shown to her room, a charming space overlooking the gardens, with a four-poster bed and a window-seat that invited contemplation. She unpacked her few belongings, then returned downstairs to meet the other members of the household. Dinner, Lavinia informed her, would be served at 8, and until then she was welcome to explore the manor and its grounds. Miss Marple took her at her word. She wandered through the house, noting its layout, its exits, the way certain doors stood ajar and others were firmly closed. She encountered Mrs. Brennan, a stout, unsmiling woman who greeted her with polite reserve, and Bessie, a young maid with anxious eyes who curtsied and hurried past. Of Philip Ashford she saw nothing, though she sensed his presence, like a shadow just out of sight. As dusk began to fall, Miss Marple made her way to the gardens. The light was golden, slanting through the trees, and the air was cool and fragrant. She found old Tom among the rose bushes, pruning with the slow, deliberate care of a man who had spent a lifetime at the task. "Good evening," she said. He looked up, his weathered face breaking into a cautious smile. "Evening, ma'am." "You'll be Miss Marple, I reckon. Mrs. Ashford said you'd be visiting." "I am indeed," Miss Marple replied. "What beautiful roses these are." Aye, they were Mrs. Ashford's pride. The first Mrs. Ashford, that is. The master, Mr. Edmund, he loved them too. Used to walk here every evening, he did, before he passed. Old Tom's voice was wistful. "He was a good man, Mr. Edmund, kind, not like some." Miss Marple's ears pricked. "Not like some?" she echoed gently. Old Tom glanced toward the house, then lowered his voice. "Meaning no disrespect, ma'am, but the new master, Mr. Gerald, he's not the same sort. Smooth as glass and twice as cold, if you ask me. But Mrs. Ashford, she seems happy enough. So it's not my place to say." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And the household, is it a happy one, would you say?" The old man's expression darkened. "There's talk, ma'am. Always is in a house like this. Quarrels between Mr. Philip and Mrs. Ashford, something about money and wills. Guests coming and going, things going missing. I keep to my garden and say nothing, but, well, I've eyes, haven't I?" "Indeed you have," Miss Marple said softly. "And I suspect they see a great deal." She thanked him and returned to the house, her mind turning over old Tom's words. As she entered the drawing-room once more, she found Lavinia standing by the window staring out at the darkening sky. "Jane," Lavinia said, without turning, "do you believe in premonitions?" Miss Marple crossed to her side. "I believe in instincts, my dear." "And yours, I think, are sound." Lavinia turned, her face pale. "I cannot shake the feeling, Jane, that something dreadful is about to happen. That all of this, the thefts, the unease, is merely the beginning." Miss Marple took her friend's hand and held it firmly. "Then we shall be watchful," she said, "and we shall discover the truth, whatever it may be." And so, as dusk fell over Maplewood's ancient oaks, Miss Marple set down her teacup and wondered who, in this house of silk and secrets, had reason to steal more than silver. Chapter 2. Gossip in the garden morning arrived at Maplewood Manor with a pale, hesitant light that filtered through the mist rising from the lawns. Miss Marple woke early, as was her habit, and after a simple breakfast in her room, tea, toast, and marmalade brought by the ever-anxious Bessie, she decided to take a turn about the gardens. The house, she had noted, was still quiet, its inhabitants likely sleeping off the previous evening's dinner, which had been a strained affair of forced conversation and sidelong glances. She slipped on her sensible walking shoes and a light cardigan, collected her knitting bag, one never knew when a few moments of leisure might present themselves, and descended the staircase with care. The manor seemed different in the morning light, less imposing perhaps, but no less watchful. Portraits regarded her from their frames with expressions that ranged from imperious to melancholic, and she wondered idly What secrets these walls had witnessed over the centuries. The gardens were a revelation. What had been lovely in the evening glow of dusk was utterly enchanting in the soft morning air. Roses climbed trellises in shades of pink and cream, lavender spilled over stone borders, and a kitchen garden flourished near the old glass house. Bees hummed industriously among the blooms, and somewhere a thrush sang its liquid, cascading song. Miss Marple breathed deeply, savoring the peace, though her mind, as always, remained alert. She found old Tom near the herbaceous borders, his gnarled hands busy among the delphiniums. He straightened as she approached, touching the brim of his cap in respectful greeting. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said. "You're an early riser, I see." "Old habits, Mr. Tom," she replied with a smile. "And what a lovely morning it is. You have created something quite beautiful here." The old gardener's weathered face softened with pride. Well, I've had 40 years to get it right. Longer than that, truth be told. I started as a lad under old Mr. Ashford. That'd be Mr. Edmund's father. He taught me everything I know. This garden's been my life, it has." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "Then you have seen many changes at Maplewood?" "That I have." Old Tom's expression grew somber. "The old master, Mr. Edmund's father, he was a hard man but fair. When he passed, Mr. Edmund took over, and things were gentler. He was a scholar, you see. Always had his nose in a book. Loved the manor, loved the gardens, loved his wife. The first Mrs. Ashford, that is. A lovely woman she was, though she died when young Mr. Philip was just a boy. Cancer it were. Terrible sad. And then Mr. Edmund married Lavinia," Miss Marple prompted gently. "Aye, some 10 years after the first Mrs. Ashford passed. By all accounts, it was a good marriage. Mrs. Lavinia, she's a kind soul, always has been. But Mr. Philip, he never took to her. Thought she was trying to replace his mother, I suppose. There was friction, no denying it. And then Mr. Edmund up and died. Heart gave out, sudden-like, 5 years ago, come November. Terrible shock to us all," Miss Marple murmured sympathetically, her needles clicking as she worked on the scarf she had brought along. "And then Mrs. Ashford remarried." Old Tom's face darkened. "Aye, that she did. Too quick to my mind, though I suppose a woman in her position. Well, Mr. Gerald came along, and within 2 years they were wed. He's younger than her by a fair bit, and—" he paused as though weighing his words. "Well, as I said yesterday, he's smooth as glass. All smiles and fine manners when folks are watching, but I've seen the way he looks at things, at the paintings, the silver, the manor itself, like he's tallying up the value. It's not my place to judge, Miss Marple, but I've worked here all my life, and I know what's right and what's not." Miss Marple's expression remained mild. "And how does Mr. Philip feel about the marriage?" "Oh, he's furious, though he hides it well enough. There was a terrible row after the wedding, something about Mr. Edmund's will. Seems the old master left near everything to Mrs. Lavinia, with Mr. Philip getting only a small annuity and the promise of the manor in due course. But with Mrs. Lavinia remarried, and Mr. Gerald in control of the estate, well, Mr. Philip sees his inheritance slipping away, doesn't he? Can't say I blame him for being bitter, but bitterness can curdle into something worse, if you take my meaning." Miss Marple took his meaning very well indeed. She thanked old Tom for his time and his insights, and continued her walk, turning over in her mind the portrait he had painted. A household divided by resentment and greed, by old wounds and new ambitions. And at its center, Lavinia, kind, fearful, and perhaps more vulnerable than she realized. As she rounded a corner near the lily pond, she nearly collided with a young woman hurrying in the opposite direction. The woman gasped and stepped back, clutching a shawl around her shoulders. "Oh, forgive me, I didn't see—" She broke off, her face flushing. "You must be Miss Marple." "I'm Clara Finch, Mrs. Ashford's cousin." Miss Marple regarded her with interest. Clara was perhaps 25, with soft brown hair and large, anxious eyes that darted about as though expecting trouble. She was dressed simply, in a pale morning gown that had seen better days, and her hands, Miss Marple noted, were red and chapped, not the hands of a woman accustomed to leisure. "How do you do?" "Miss Finch," Miss Marple said warmly. "I hope I did not startle you." No, it was my fault entirely," Clara said quickly. "I was not paying attention. I often walk in the mornings. It helps to clear my head." "A sensible habit," Miss Marple agreed. "Might I walk with you a little way?" Clara seemed uncertain, but nodded, and they fell into step together. For a few moments neither spoke. Miss Marple waited, her patience as steady as the turning of the earth, and presently Clara said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Miss Marple, may I ask, has Mrs. Ashford spoken to you of any difficulties?" "She has mentioned certain concerns," Miss Marple replied carefully. "Why do you ask?" Clara bit her lip, then seemed to come to a decision. "Because I believe her concerns are justified. I have felt it too, this sense that something is wrong in this house. She hesitated, then plunged on. "I believe someone has been reading my correspondence." Miss Marple's needles stilled. "Indeed? What makes you think so?" "My letters. I keep them in a writing case in my room. Twice now I have found them, not quite as I left them. Small things, you understand. A ribbon untied, pages out of order. I thought at first I was being careless, but yesterday I set a trap. I placed a single hair across the lock of the case. When I returned, the hair was gone." "How very distressing," Miss Marple said. "Have you told Mrs. Ashford?" Clara shook her head. "I did not wish to add to her troubles. And I cannot help but think that whoever is doing this is looking for something. I have debts, Miss Marple. I lost nearly everything in a foolish investment scheme 2 years ago, and I am entirely dependent on Cousin Lavinia's generosity. I write letters sometimes, begging for more help, for extensions on payments. I am ashamed of them. If someone were to find them, to show them to Lavinia, she might think me grasping and ungrateful. And are you?" Miss Marple asked not unkindly. "I am grateful," Clara said, her eyes filling with tears. "More than I can say. But I am also desperate, Miss Marple, and desperate people, I know, are often suspected of terrible things." Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "Desperation is not the same as wickedness, my dear. But I would advise you to keep your letters secure, and to be watchful." They parted soon after, Clara hurrying back toward the house, and Miss Marple continuing her circuit of the gardens. The picture was growing clearer now, she thought. A household in which privacy was violated, secrets were sought, and fear simmered beneath a veneer of civility. She would need to observe the others, Philip, Gerald, Dr. Hargrave, Mr. Dunley, and piece together the full mosaic of motive and opportunity. Luncheon was served in the dining room at 1 o'clock. The table was laid with fine china and crystal, and the meal, cold meats, salads, and fresh bread, was simple but elegant. Miss Marple found herself seated between Dr. Hargrave and Mr. Dunley, with Lavinia at the head of the table and a Gerald at the foot. Clara sat beside Lavinia, still looking pale and anxious, and Philip occupied a seat near the window, his expression sullen. Dr. Hargrave was a man of middle age, with graying hair and a kind, careworn face. He greeted Miss Marple with genuine warmth and inquired politely about her journey. As they talked, Miss Marple observed him carefully. He seemed devoted to Lavinia, his gaze often straying to her with a sort of wistful sadness that spoke of old affection unreciprocated. There was no malice in him that she could detect, only a quiet sorrow. Mr. Dunley, on the other hand, was a different creature altogether. He was American, brash, and confident, with a booming laugh and a tendency to dominate the conversation. He spoke enthusiastically about the Manor's art collection, pointing out the paintings that adorned the walls and holding forth on their provenance and value. "That portrait there," he said, gesturing with his fork, "is a Gneller, unless I'm very much mistaken. Worth a small fortune, I should think, and the landscapes in the hall School of Constables, surely." "You are sitting on a gold mine, Mrs. Ashford," Lavinia smiled faintly. "They have been in the family for generations, Mr. Dunley. I could not part with them." Of course," Dunley said, though his eyes gleamed with a collector's hunger. "Still, it never hurts to know what one has, eh?" Miss Marple turned her attention to Philip, who had said nothing throughout the meal. He was a young man of perhaps 30, dark-haired and handsome in a brooding sort of way, but his face was marked by bitterness. He caught her gaze and looked away, his jaw tight. After luncheon, the party dispersed. Dr. Hargrave offered to show Miss Marple the library, and she accepted gladly. It was a beautiful room, lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes, and she spent a pleasant hour there, discussing literature and local history. The doctor, she learned, had been a close friend of Edmund Ashford's, and had attended him in his final illness. "It was a great shock," he said quietly. "Edmund seemed in perfect health one day, and the next his heart simply gave out." Lavinia was devastated. She and I have remained friends, and I visit often, but he trailed off, his expression sad. She deserves better than this, Miss Marple. Better than all of this? Miss Marple understood his meaning. You care for her a great deal, Dr. Hargrave? He met her eyes. I have cared for her since we were young, but she loved Edmund, and I would never have stood in the way of her happiness. Now, though? He shook his head. Forgive me. I should not speak out of turn. There is no need to apologize, Miss Marple said gently. Love is never out of turn. That evening, after dinner, Miss Marple retired to her room and sat by the window, gazing out at the moonlit gardens. She thought of all she had learned that day, old Tom's loyalty and suspicion, Clara's fear and desperation, Dr. Hargrave's unrequited love, Mr. Dunley's covetous interest, Philip's simmering resentment, and Gerald's cold charm. And over it all, Lavinia's unease, a fear that something far worse than petty theft was lurking in the shadows. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had learned that gardens held secrets as surely as locked drawers, and Maplewood's roses, she suspected, had thorns sharper than most. Chapter 3. A Scream in the Night. The third evening at Maplewood Manor began with a semblance of normalcy, or at least what passed for normalcy in a household threaded through with tension and unspoken animosity. Lavinia had insisted on hosting a formal dinner, hoping, Miss Marple suspected, that the ritual of dressing and dining might impose some order on the household's fraying edges. The dining room was lit by dozens of candles, their flames casting warm, flickering light across the polished mahogany table and the faces gathered around it. Miss Marple, seated to Lavinia's right, observed each guest with the quiet attentiveness of one who had spent a lifetime studying human nature. Gerald presided at the foot of the table, resplendent in evening dress, his manner that of a gracious host. Yet there was something watchful in his eyes, a calculation that never quite left him. Philip sat opposite Miss Marple, silent and brooding, his wine-glass emptied and refilled with alarming frequency. Clara Finch, pale and nervous, picked at her food and spoke only when directly addressed. Dr. Hargrave made gentle conversation with Lavinia, his concern for her evident in every word and glance. And Mr. Dunley, ebullient as ever, regaled the table with stories of his travels and acquisitions, oblivious, or perhaps indifferent, to the undercurrent swirling around him. I must say, Mrs. Ashford, Dunley boomed, raising his glass, you keep a magnificent house. The art alone, why, it's a collection worthy of a museum. I was admiring the Gainsborough in the hall this afternoon. Exquisite, simply exquisite. Lavinia smiled politely, though the smile did not reach her eyes. You are very kind, Mr. Dunley. My late husband was a great lover of art. And you, Mr. Ashford? Dunley turned to Gerald. Do you share that passion? Gerald's expression was smooth, his tone affable. I appreciate beauty, certainly. But my interests lie more in the practical management of the estate. Art, after all, is only as valuable as one's ability to preserve and protect it. It was a perfectly reasonable answer. Yet Miss Marple noted the faint tightening of Philip's jaw and the way Clara's gaze dropped to her plate. Gerald's words, she thought, were a reminder, subtle but unmistakable, that he was now master of Maplewood, and all within it. The conversation drifted on, stilted and uncomfortable, until at last the meal drew to a close. Lavinia rose, and the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room, while the gentlemen remained behind for port and cigars. Miss Marple settled into her accustomed chair by the fire, her knitting needles resuming their rhythmic click. Clara sat nearby, her hands twisting in her lap, and Lavinia stood by the window, gazing out into the darkness. I do wish, Lavinia said softly, that I could shake this feeling of dread. It is foolish, I know, but it clings to me like a shadow. It is not foolish, Miss Marple said firmly. Your instincts have been correct thus far, my dear. Someone in this house has been invading your privacy, and until we know who and why, it is only sensible to remain on your guard. Lavinia turned, her face drawn. But what can I do, Jane? I cannot accuse anyone without proof, and even if I had proof, what then? Gerald thinks I am imagining things. Philip despises me. Clara is frightened half to death. Dr. Hargrave hovers over me like a worried parent, and Mr. Dunley, well, he seems to see nothing beyond the value of the paintings, "Then we must find the proof," Miss Marple said, "and we must do so quietly, before whoever is behind this grows bolder." Before Lavinia could respond, the gentleman rejoined them, and the evening continued with desultory conversation and the pretense of conviviality. By 10:30, the household began to retire. Miss Marple bade Lavinia good night, noting the shadows beneath her friend's eyes and the tremor in her hands, and made her way upstairs to her room. She undressed slowly, her mind turning over the events of the past days. The thefts, the violated correspondence, the atmosphere of mistrust, it all pointed to someone with a specific goal, someone searching for something. But what? Money? Evidence? Blackmail material? She resolved to speak with Bessie in the morning, to learn more about the household's routines and who had access to which rooms. She was just about to extinguish her bedside lamp when a scream shattered the stillness of the night. It was a piercing, anguished sound full of shock and terror, and it came from somewhere below. Miss Marple was on her feet in an instant, snatching up her dressing gown and hurrying into the corridor. Doors were flung open and figures emerged in various states of undress. Gerald in shirt-sleeves, Philip with his hair disheveled, Dr. Hargrave still fully dressed, and Clara clutching a shawl around her nightgown. They all converged on the staircase, following the sound of sobbing. In the hallway outside Lavinia's suite, they found Bessie, the young maid, collapsed against the wall, her face white and her hands trembling. The door to Lavinia's sitting room stood open, and the room beyond was in chaos. Lavinia herself stood in the center of the wreckage, her face stricken. Papers were strewn across the floor, drawers hung open, cushions had been flung from the sofa, and the delicate escritoire where she kept her correspondence had been ransacked. Miss Marple's sharp eyes took in every detail: the broken lock on the escritoire, the scatter of envelopes, the ashes in the fireplace where something, letters, perhaps, had been burned. "What on earth?" Gerald began, but Lavinia cut him off, her voice shaking with fury and fear. "Someone has been in my rooms, Gerald. Someone has gone through my private papers, my letters, everything." "Calm yourself, my dear," Gerald said, his tone soothing, but tinged with impatience. "It is distressing, certainly, but there is no need for hysterics. Perhaps Bessie can explain." "I can't explain nothing, sir," Bessie wailed. "I brought Mrs. Ashford her nightcap at 10, just like always, and the room was as it should be. I swear it. I locked the door behind me when I left, just like she told me to. I don't know how this happened." Miss Marple moved quietly into the room, her gaze sweeping over the scene. Among the scattered papers, she glimpsed the corner of a note, its edges charred but the words still partially visible. She bent down, her movements unobtrusive, and read, "You know what you did. It won't stay hidden." The words were scrawled in an angry, uneven hand, and they sent a chill down Miss Marple's spine. This was not mere theft. This was a warning or a threat. "Lavinia," Dr. Hargrave said gently, crossing to her side, "you must sit down. This has been a terrible shock." But Lavinia shook her head, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "No, James, this is not shock. This is certainty. Someone in this house means me harm. I have said it all along, and no one would listen." "We should call the police," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Surely this is a matter for the police?" Gerald's expression hardened. "Absolutely not. The last thing this family needs is a scandal. We will handle this internally. I will speak to the staff, and we will get to the bottom of it." "Internally?" Philip spoke for the first time, his tone dripping with scorn. "And how do you propose to do that, Gerald?" "By asking nicely who broke into my stepmother's room. This is absurd. If someone here is a thief, or worse, they should be exposed." "And what would you know of exposure, Philip?" Gerald shot back. "You who have been skulking about this house for weeks, resentful and bitter, waiting for your chance to—" "To what?" Philip's voice was dangerously quiet. "To reclaim what is rightfully mine? Yes, I resent the way my father's will was written. Yes, I resent you, Gerald, for worming your way into this family and taking control of everything. But I would never harm Lavinia. Never." The two men faced each other, tension crackling between them, and for a moment Miss Marple thought they might come to blows. But then Lavinia stepped between them, her voice rising. "Enough! Both of you, enough. I will not have this house torn apart by accusations and anger. Whoever did this, whatever their reasons, we will find out. But not like this." She turned to Miss Marple, her expression pleading. "Jane, please help me. You see things others do not. You understand people. If anyone can uncover the truth, it is you." Miss Marple met her gaze and nodded. "I will do all I can, my dear, but we must proceed carefully, and we must all be honest with one another, for secrets, I have found, are the soil in which wickedness grows." The household slowly dispersed, each retreating to their rooms with sidelong glances and whispered speculations. Miss Marple remained behind, kneeling by the fireplace to examine the ashes more closely. Among them she found fragments of paper, the remnants of letters that had been hastily burned. She could make out only a few words: solicitor, divorce, will. The implications were clear. Someone had discovered that Lavinia was planning to leave Gerald, to change her will, and they had acted to destroy the evidence. But who? Gerald himself, desperate to prevent the loss of his comfortable position? Philip, hoping to hasten his inheritance? Or someone else entirely, with motives yet unknown? As Miss Marple returned to her room, she paused at the top of the stairs and looked back toward Lavinia's suite. A single candle still burned in the sitting room, its light a small, defiant flicker against the encroaching dark. As the household returned uneasily to bed, Miss Marple remained by the window, her knitting forgotten, for she had seen fear in Lavinia's face, and something far darker in her husband's. Chapter 4. Patterns and suspicions. The following morning dawned gray and sullen, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain. The atmosphere within Maplewood Manor mirrored the weather, oppressive, tense, and charged with unspoken accusations. Breakfast was a subdued affair, with most of the household avoiding eye contact and speaking only when necessary. Lavinia did not appear at all, sending word through Bessie that she was unwell and would remain in her rooms. Miss Marple noted this with concern, but said nothing, knowing that sometimes retreat was the only defense against overwhelming distress. After breakfast, Miss Marple sought out Mrs. Brennan, the housekeeper, hoping to glean more information about the household's routines and who might have had access to Lavinia's rooms the previous evening. She found the woman in her sitting room, a small, neat space off the kitchen, going over household accounts with a stern expression. "Mrs. Brennan," Miss Marple began, settling into a chair without waiting for an invitation. "I wonder if I might have a word?" The housekeeper looked up, her expression guarded. "If it's about last night, Miss Marple, I've already told Mr. Gerald all I know, which is precious little. I locked up as usual at 10 o'clock, and I saw nothing out of the ordinary." "I'm sure you did your duty admirably," Miss Marple said, mildly. "But I am curious about the household itself. You have been here many years, I understand." 15 years come Michaelmas," Mrs. Brennan said, her tone softening slightly. "I came to work for Mr. Edmund shortly after he married Mrs. Lavinia. He was a good master, fair and kind. Mrs. Lavinia, too, though I'll admit I had my doubts at first. But she won me over. She's a good woman, Miss Marple, and she doesn't deserve what's happening to her." "What is happening to her, do you think?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Brennan hesitated, then said, "I think someone in this house is trying to drive her to distraction, or worse. The thefts, the letters, the invasion of her privacy. It's calculated, Miss Marple. Whoever is doing it knows exactly what they're about. And who do you suspect?" The housekeeper's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm not one to cast aspersions without proof, but I will say this. Mr. Philip has been like a black cloud since his father passed. He resented Mrs. Lavinia from the start, and when Mr. Edmund left the bulk of the estate to her, Philip was beside himself. There were terrible rows, Miss Marple, shouting, accusations. He claimed his father had been unduly influenced, that Mrs. Lavinia had manipulated him. It was ugly. And Mr. Gerald?" Mrs. Brennan's expression grew even stonier. "Mr. Gerald is a smooth operator, as they say. He swept Mrs. Lavinia off her feet, I'll grant him that. But I've seen the way he looks at things, appraising, calculating. He married her for her money, Miss Marple. I'd stake my life on it. And now that she's talking of making changes, he's grown nervous. Angry even, though he hides it well." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Making changes? What sort of changes?" Mrs. Brennan glanced toward the door, as if to ensure they were alone, then lowered her voice. "She's been in correspondence with her solicitor, Mr. Pemberton, in London. I heard her on the telephone with him last week. She was asking about divorces, how one might go about obtaining one, and whether her will could be altered to exclude Mr. Gerald. She was very distressed, Miss Marple, and trying to keep it quiet." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "The pieces beginning to fall into place. And who else might know of these plans? Hard to say. Bessie might have overheard something. She's often in and out of Mrs. Lavinia's rooms. And Mr. Gerald himself, if he's been going through her correspondence. Which, given the break-in last night, seems likely. Miss Marple thanked the housekeeper and took her leave, her mind working rapidly. If Gerald had discovered Lavinia's plans to divorce him and disinherit him, he had powerful motive to act, either to destroy the evidence or to silence Lavinia herself. But was he capable of murder? That remained to be seen. She found Dr. Hargrave in the library, reading quietly by the fire. He looked up as she entered, his face drawn and weary. "Miss Marple," he said, rising. "How is Lavinia this morning?" "I tried to call on her, but Bessie said she was resting." "She is understandably distressed," Miss Marple replied, taking a seat. "Dr. Hargrave, may I speak frankly with you?" "Of course. You have known Mrs. Ashford for many years, and you care for her deeply. What is your assessment of her marriage to Mr. Gerald?" The doctor's expression grew pained. "My assessment is that it was a mistake, a terrible mistake. I tried to warn her, Miss Marple, but she would not listen. She was lonely after Edmund's death, and Gerald was charming and attentive. She thought he loved her, but I have watched him these past 3 years, and I see only calculation. He spends her money freely, entertains his friends at her expense, and treats her with a coldness that breaks my heart. Do you believe he might harm her?" Dr. Hargrave met her eyes, his own filled with dread. "I believe, Miss Marple, that Gerald Ashford is a man who will do whatever is necessary to protect his interests. Whether that includes harm, I pray not, but I cannot be certain." Miss Marple thanked him and left the library, her thoughts troubled. She next sought out Clara Finch, whom she found in the morning room, staring listlessly out at the gardens. "Miss Finch," Miss Marple said gently, "may I join you?" Clara started, then nodded. "Of course, Miss Marple. Forgive me, I was wool-gathering." "Understandable, given the circumstances." Miss Marple settled beside her. "My dear, you mentioned that you believed someone had been reading your correspondence. Do you still think so?" Clara's hands twisted in her lap. "I am certain of it. And after last night—" "Miss Marple, I am frightened. What if whoever broke into Mrs. Ashford's rooms comes to mine next? What if they are searching for my letters that might incriminate me?" "Incriminate you how?" Clara's face crumpled. "I have debts, Miss Marple, terrible debts. 2 years ago I invested nearly all my money in a venture recommended by Dr. Hargrave. It was supposed to be safe, a sure return, but it failed spectacularly. I lost everything. I wrote to Cousin Lavinia begging for help, and she has been more than generous. But the debts keep mounting, and I have written desperate, shameful letters asking for more. If someone were to show those letters to Lavinia, she might think me a parasite, a schemer. She might cast me out. And who might have reason to do such a thing?" Miss Marple asked. Clara shook her head. "I don't know. Philip, perhaps, if he wishes to turn Lavinia against anyone who might support her. Or Gerald, if he wants to isolate her, to make her doubt everyone around her." Miss Marple considered this. It was a plausible theory. By sowing discord and mistrust, Gerald might hope to ensure that Lavinia had no allies when he finally moved against her. Or was she giving him too much credit? Perhaps the thief was merely opportunistic, seeking to blackmail or manipulate. That afternoon, Miss Marple encountered Mr. Dunley in the hall, once again admiring the paintings. She paused to speak with him, and he greeted her with his usual boisterous cheerfulness. "Ah, Miss Marple, just the woman I wanted to see. I've been thinking these paintings really ought to be appraised. Mrs. Ashford may not realize their true value. I believe she values them for their sentimental worth." "Mr. Dunley," Miss Marple said. Of course," Dunley said, waving a hand. "But sentiment doesn't pay the bills, eh? And I happen to know a chap in London who could arrange a private sale. Very discreet, very profitable." "I am certain Mrs. Ashford has no intention of selling," Miss Marple said coolly. Dunley's expression flickered, just for a moment, and she saw something calculating in his eyes. "Well, one never knows when circumstances might change," he said. "It never hurts to have options." Miss Marple excused herself, deeply unsettled. Was Dunley merely a boorish opportunist, or was there something more sinister at play? And then, quite by chance, she encountered old Tom near the glass-house, and he drew her aside with an urgent expression. "Miss Marple, I saw something last night that I think you ought to know. I was doing my rounds. I like to check the glass-house before bed, make sure everything's secure, and I saw Mr. Dunley. He was out by the east wing, near Mrs. Ashford's windows, and he had a camera. He was photographing the paintings through the glass. Miss Marple's eyes widened. "Are you quite certain?" "As certain as I stand here," old Tom said. "When he saw me, he made some excuse about being an admirer of architecture, but it didn't sit right." "I thought you should know." Miss Marple thanked him warmly and returned to the house, her mind racing. The picture was becoming clearer. Gerald desperate to maintain his position, Philip bitter and resentful, Clara frightened and vulnerable, Dr. Hargrave protective, but perhaps too protective, and Dunley far more than a simple art enthusiast. Each had secrets, each had motives, and each, she suspected, was capable of more than they appeared. That evening she sat with Lavinia in her sitting room, now restored to order, though the violated atmosphere lingered. Lavinia looked pale and exhausted, her hands trembling as she poured tea. "Jane," she said quietly, "I am so glad you are here. I do not know what I would do without you." "You would manage," Miss Marple said. "You are stronger than you think, my dear, but you must be honest with me. Are you planning to divorce Gerald?" Lavinia's cup rattled in its saucer. "How did you—" "Mrs. Brennan overheard your telephone conversation," Miss Marple said gently, "and I believe Gerald may have discovered your plans." Lavinia closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Yes, I have been a fool, Jane. I married him because I was lonely, and I thought he cared for me. But he doesn't. He cares only for my money for Maplewood. And I cannot live like this any longer. I have contacted my solicitor, and I intend to file for divorce and change my will. But if Gerald then he is dangerous," Miss Marple finished, "and we must be very, very careful." In Miss Marple's experience, people who stole letters were often searching for proof, but proof of what, she wondered, and for whom? Chapter 5. The Poisoned Nightcap. The 5th day at Maplewood Manor began, much as the previous one had ended, beneath a pall of suspicion and unease. The rain that had threatened finally arrived, drumming against the windows with a relentless insistence that seemed to echo the household's fraying nerves. Miss Marple spent the morning in quiet observation, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she sat in the drawing-room, watching and listening. Lavinia moved through the house like a ghost, pale and distracted, starting at every sound. Gerald, by contrast, was unnaturally jovial, his laughter too loud, his smiles too bright, as though he were trying to convince the world, or perhaps himself, that all was well. Philip kept to his rooms, emerging only for meals, and Clara hovered anxiously at the edges of every gathering, her eyes red from weeping. Dr. Hargrave remained close to Lavinia, his concern evident, while Mr. Dunley seemed oblivious to the tension, chattering endlessly about art and auctions. Miss Marple noted it all, filing away each gesture, each word, each fleeting expression. She had lived long enough to know that people revealed themselves in small ways, in the things they said when they thought no one was listening, in the way they moved when they believed they were unobserved. And here at Maplewood, the revelations were coming thick and fast. That afternoon, she managed a private conversation with Bessie, the maid, whom she found in the linen room, folding sheets with trembling hands. "Bessie," Miss Marple said gently, "I know you are frightened, but I need you to think very carefully. On the night of the break-in, you brought Mrs. Ashford her nightcap at 10 o'clock, as usual. Did you see anyone in the corridor?" Bessie's face crumpled. "No, ma'am, I didn't. But I was in a hurry. Mrs. Brennan had scolded me for being slow, and I just wanted to finish my duties and get to bed. I locked the door behind me when I left Mrs. Ashford's room, just like she told me to." "I swear I did." "I believe you," Miss Marple said. "But tell me, who else has keys to Mrs. Ashford's suite?" "Well, Mrs. Ashford herself, of course, and Mr. Gerald, since he's her husband. And Mrs. Brennan has a master key for all the rooms in case of emergencies." "And who prepares Mrs. Ashford's nightcap?" "I do, ma'am. Every evening. She likes warm milk with a little honey and cinnamon. I make it in the kitchen and bring it up on a tray." "And does anyone else ever handle it?" Bessie hesitated. "Well, sometimes if I'm busy, Mrs. Brennan will take it up. And once or twice Mr. Gerald has said he'll take it to her to save me the trouble. He's very considerate that way." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but inwardly her instincts sharpened. Gerald taking the nightcap to his wife? How very considerate indeed. That evening, dinner was an even more strained affair than usual. The rain lashed against the windows, and the candles flickered in their sconces, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Conversation was stilted and awkward, each person wrapped in their own thoughts. Miss Marple watched Gerald closely, noting the way his gaze kept drifting to Lavinia, his expression unreadable. After the meal, Lavinia pleaded exhaustion and retired early. Dr. Hargrave offered to see her to her room, but she gently declined, insisting she wished to be alone. Miss Marple, deeply uneasy, excused herself shortly thereafter and went upstairs, pausing outside Lavinia's door. She could hear her friend moving about within, and after a moment's hesitation, she knocked softly. "Lavinia, it's Jane. May I come in?" The door opened, and Lavinia, already in her dressing gown, managed a wan smile. "Of course, dear. Forgive me. I am poor company tonight." "You need not apologize," Miss Marple said, stepping inside. "I only wanted to assure myself that you are well." "As well as can be expected," Lavinia said, sinking into a chair by the fire. "I feel as though I am living in a nightmare, Jane. Everyone around me seems a stranger, or worse, an enemy." "You must not lose heart," Miss Marple said firmly. "We are close to the truth, I am certain of it. But you must promise me something. Anything. Do not drink anything tonight that you have not prepared yourself. And lock your door, bolt it if you can. Trust no one." Lavinia's eyes widened. "Jane, you don't think—" "I think it is better to be cautious," Miss Marple said. "Promise me." "I promise," Lavinia whispered. Miss Marple returned to her own room, but she did not undress. Instead, she sat by her door, listening to the sounds of the house settling for the night. Footsteps passed in the corridor, Mrs. Brennan making her final rounds. A door closed somewhere below. Silence fell, broken only by the drumming of the rain, and then, at 11:30, she heard it. A soft knock on Lavinia's door, and the murmur of voices. She rose quickly and slipped into the corridor, staying in the shadows. Through the crack in Lavinia's door, she saw Gerald, a tray in his hands, smiling his practiced smile. "I thought you might like your nightcap after all, my dear," he was saying. "Bessie was busy, so I brought it myself." Lavinia, in her nightgown, hesitated. "That is kind of you, Gerald, but I am not thirsty." "Nonsense," he said, his tone cajoling. "You always have your nightcap. It will help you sleep. Come now, don't be difficult." Miss Marple's heart pounded. She stepped forward into the light. "Good evening, Mr. Ashford." Gerald's head snapped around, his expression flickering from surprise to annoyance. "Miss Marple, what are you doing up at this hour?" "I might ask the same of you," she said mildly, her gaze fixed on the glass of milk on the tray. "Mrs. Ashford, I do not think you should drink that." Lavinia's face went white. "Jane, what—" "Do not drink it," Miss Marple repeated, her voice calm but unyielding. "Mr. Ashford, I suggest you take that tray back to the kitchen." Gerald's mask slipped, and for a moment pure fury blazed in his eyes. "This is absurd. I have brought my wife a glass of milk, and you—" But before he could finish, Lavinia reached out and took the glass, holding it up to the light. Her hand shook. "There is something in it," she whispered. "At the bottom, sediment." "Jane, you are right." Gerald's face drained of color. "Lavinia, Get out," she said, her voice trembling with rage and fear. "Get out of my room. Get out of my house. Lavinia, please, you don't understand. Get out!" She screamed, and the sound echoed through the manor. Doors flew open. Dr. Hargrave appeared, disheveled and alarmed, followed by Philip, Clara, and Mrs. Brennan. They crowded into the corridor, staring at the scene. Lavinia, holding the glass like a piece of damning evidence. Gerald, white-faced and cornered, and Miss Marple, standing between them, her expression serene, but her eyes as sharp as steel. "What in God's name is going on?" Philip demanded. "Mr. Ashford has just attempted to poison his wife," Miss Marple said calmly. The words fell like stones. Gerald made a choking sound, half denial, half rage, and turned as if to flee. But Dr. Hargrave, moving with surprising speed, blocked his path. "You're not going anywhere," the doctor said, his voice shaking with fury. "Lavinia, go downstairs." As the police car disappeared into the rainy night, the household stood in the hall, stunned and silent. Miss Marple, alone among them, felt no surprise, only a deep, weary sadness, for she had seen this pattern before in a dozen villages and 100 households. The marriage built on lies, the desperation of a man facing ruin, the terrible logic that led from theft to murder. As the constables combed the manor, Miss Marple sat alone in the drawing-room, her knitting in her lap, and thought of a village tale, of a man who killed not from hate, but from fear of losing what he had stolen. The manor, despite the late hour and the turmoil, did not sleep. Inspector Craddock, having secured Gerald Ashford in the back of the police vehicle, returned to the house to conduct preliminary interviews and to ensure the scene was properly documented. His constables moved through the rooms with quiet efficiency, photographing the glass of milk, taking statements, and noting the layout of Lavinia's suite. Miss Marple, at the inspector's request, remained close, offering her observations with the same calm precision she might have used to describe a knitting pattern. Lavinia, too shaken to speak coherently, was attended by Dr. Hargrave, who administered a mild sedative and insisted she rest. Clara Finch, her face streaked with tears, sat beside her cousin, murmuring words of comfort. Philip Ashford, for once stripped of his sullen resentment, paced the drawing-room like a caged animal, his hands clenched into fists. "I should have seen it," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "I should have known he was capable of this, but I was so consumed by my own bitterness, my own grievances, that I was blind to the real danger. You are not alone in that," Miss Marple said gently, pausing in her knitting to regard him. "We all see what we wish to see, Mr. Ashford, and overlook what we cannot bear to acknowledge." He met her gaze, his expression haunted. "She could have died tonight. If not for you, Miss Marple, she would have died. And He broke off, his voice cracking. "I have treated her abominably. She was kind to me when my father died, and I repaid her with resentment and spite. How can I ever make amends?" "By being the man your father believed you could be," Miss Marple said. "It is never too late to choose honor over bitterness, Mr. Ashford." He nodded slowly, and some of the tension left his shoulders. A moment later, Inspector Craddock entered the room, his notebook in hand. "Miss Marple," he said, "I wonder if I might trouble you for a fuller account of what led you to suspect Mr. Ashford?" Miss Marple set down her knitting and folded her hands in her lap. "Certainly, Inspector. It was, as these things so often are, a matter of small details, that, when taken together, formed a pattern." She recounted the thefts, the violated correspondence, the ransacking of Lavinia's sitting room, and the burned letters. Mrs. Ashford had been in consultation with her solicitor regarding a divorce and a change to her will. I believe Mr. Ashford discovered this, likely through his own searches of her papers, and realized that his comfortable position was about to come to an abrupt end. The thefts and the break-in were his attempts to find and destroy any evidence of her intentions. But when he could not be certain he had succeeded, he decided to act more decisively. "But how did you know tonight would be the night?" Craddock asked. "I did not know for certain," Miss Marple admitted, "but I had learned from Bessie, the maid, that Mr. Ashford had on occasion delivered Mrs. Ashford's nightcap himself, claiming to be helpful. It struck me as odd. Why would a man bother with such a trivial task unless he had a specific reason? And when I considered that Mrs. Ashford took her nightcap every evening at the same time, I realized it would be the perfect opportunity for poisoning. It is a routine, predictable, and private. So I warned Mrs. Ashford not to drink anything she had not prepared herself, and I kept watch. When Mr. Ashford appeared with the tray tonight, despite Bessie being perfectly capable of performing the task, I knew my suspicions were correct." Inspector Craddock nodded slowly, his expression one of grudging admiration. "And you acted quickly enough to prevent a tragedy." "I am in your debt, Miss Marple." "You owe me nothing, Inspector," she replied. "I simply did what needed to be done." The inspector turned his attention to Philip. "Mr. Ashford, I shall need a statement from you as well, but I must ask, did you have any knowledge of your stepfather's intentions?" Philip shook his head vehemently. "None whatsoever. I despised the man, I'll not deny it, and I resented my stepmother's marriage to him. But I would never have stood by while he plotted murder. Never." "Very well," Craddock said, making a note. "And Mr. Dunley, where is he?" "He retired to his room some time ago," Mrs. Brennan said, appearing in the doorway. "Shall I fetch him, Inspector?" "If you would," Craddock said. Mr. Dunley arrived a few minutes later, bleary-eyed and bewildered, his dressing gown hastily tied. "What on earth is happening?" he demanded. "I was woken by all the commotion, but no one will tell me anything. Mr. Gerald Ashford has been arrested for the attempted murder of his wife," Inspector Craddock said bluntly. Dunley's jaw dropped. "Murder? Good God, I had no idea. I mean, I thought the fellow was a bit slippery, but murder— Mr. Dunley, Miss Marple said, fixing him with a penetrating gaze. I wonder if you might explain why you were photographing the Manor's paintings through the windows late at night. Dunley's face flushed. That is, well, I am an art enthusiast, as I've said, and I merely wish to— You were hired by Mr. Philip Ashford to gather evidence of Mr. Gerald's fraudulent activities, were you not? Miss Marple said. You are a private investigator, not merely a collector. Dunley's bluster collapsed. Yes, he admitted. Yes, I was hired by Mr. Philip. He suspected Gerald of defrauding Mrs. Ashford, and he wanted proof. I was investigating the paintings because I believed Gerald might be planning to sell them and pocket the proceeds. But I swear, I had no knowledge of any plot to harm Mrs. Ashford. Inspector Craddock made a note of this, his expression stern. We will need to verify your story, Mr. Dunley. For now, you are not to leave the manor. Of course, Dunley said hastily. The interviews continued for another hour, each member of the household giving their account of the evening's events. Clara Finch spoke of her fear and her gratitude that Miss Marple had intervened. Dr. Hargrave recounted his long friendship with Lavinia and his growing suspicions of Gerald's character. Mrs. Brennan confirmed the details of the household routines, and Gerald's occasional insistence on delivering the nightcap himself. At last, as the clock struck 2, Inspector Craddock declared himself satisfied for the night. I shall return in the morning to complete my investigation, he said. For now, I suggest you all try to get some rest, though I doubt any of you will sleep easily. He was right. The household dispersed to their rooms, but the atmosphere was one of shell-shocked wakefulness. Miss Marple, returning to her own chamber, sat by the window and watched the rain continue its relentless assault on the gardens. She thought of Gerald Ashford, now sitting in a police cell, his carefully constructed life in ruins. She thought of Lavinia, betrayed by the man she had trusted and loved. And she thought, as she so often did, of the fragility of human goodness, and the ease with which greed and fear could twist a soul beyond recognition. People, she murmured to herself, are so very predictable, and yet each time one hopes they will prove otherwise. Chapter 6. Hidden Motives Unveiled. The morning after Gerald Ashford's arrest dawned cold and clear, the storm having passed in Maplewood the night and left behind a world scrubbed clean and glistening. Yet within Maplewood Manor the atmosphere remained heavy, oppressive, as though the house itself were still reeling from the violence that had nearly occurred within its walls. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom, and found the household already astir, though no one seemed quite certain what to do with themselves. Lavinia remained in her rooms, under Dr. Hargrave's watchful care. The doctor had spent the night in a chair outside her door, determined that no further harm should come to her, and when Miss Marple encountered him in the corridor, he looked haggard and drawn, his eyes red from lack of sleep. "How is she?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Sleeping, thank God," Dr. Hargrave replied. "The sedative I gave her was strong enough to grant her a few hours of peace, but when she wakes—" He shook his head. "How does one recover from such a betrayal? Miss Marple, to know that the man you married, the man you trusted, was prepared to murder you for your money?" "One recovers slowly," Miss Marple said, "and with the support of true friends. She has you, Dr. Hargrave, and she has others who care for her. That will make all the difference." The doctor managed a wan smile. "You are kind. I only wish I had acted sooner, had seen what Gerald was planning. I failed her, Miss Marple." "You did not fail her," Miss Marple said firmly. "You were vigilant, and when the moment came, you stood by her. That is not failure. That is loyalty." Inspector Craddock arrived at mid-morning, accompanied by a detective sergeant and a constable. He had with him the results of the preliminary analysis of the milk, which confirmed the presence of arsenic, enough to kill, though perhaps not immediately. The poison had been mixed with something sweet, likely honey, to mask its bitter taste, and the dose suggested that Gerald had intended Lavinia to suffer a lingering, painful death that might have been attributed to natural causes. He was clever. He underestimated his wife's instincts, Miss Marple said. Mrs. Ashford knew something was wrong, even if she could not articulate what. She reached out to me for help, and that act of reaching out was his undoing. He also underestimated the loyalty of the household staff, Mrs. Brennan, Old Tom, Bessie. They observed him, they noted his behavior, and they were willing to speak of it when asked. And finally, he underestimated the power of small details. The rinsed glass, the burned letters. His insistence on delivering the nightcap himself. Each was a thread, and when woven together, they revealed the full pattern of his guilt. Craddock sipped his tea thoughtfully. "I have been questioning Mr. Ashford this morning. He has confessed, Miss Marple, though not without attempting to justify himself. He claims he loved Mrs. Ashford, but that she had turned against him, that she was planning to divorce him and leave him destitute. He said he felt he had no choice." "There is always a choice," Miss Marple said quietly. "He chose greed over honor and murder over honesty. Those were his choices, and now he must live with the consequences." The inspector nodded. "Indeed. He will be formally charged with attempted murder this afternoon, and I expect he will stand trial within a few months. The evidence is overwhelming, thanks in large part to your intervention, Miss Marple." "I did only what was necessary," Miss Marple said. "But tell me, Inspector, what of the thefts and the ransacking of Mrs. Ashford's sitting room? Has Mr. Ashford confessed to those as well?" "He has," Craddock confirmed. "He admitted that he had been searching for evidence of her intentions to divorce him and alter her will. He found letters from her solicitor detailing the process, and he burned them in an attempt to destroy the evidence. He also went through Miss Finch's correspondence, hoping to find something he could use to turn Mrs. Ashford against her cousin and isolate her further. He wanted her vulnerable, friendless, and entirely dependent on him." Miss Marple's expression grew sad. "How very calculating, and how very tragic, for he might have lived a comfortable life had he simply been content with what he had. But greed is a corrosive thing, Inspector. It eats away at the soul until nothing remains but hollow ambition and fear." As the morning wore on, the household slowly began to emerge from their shock. Philip Ashford sought out Miss Marple in the library, where she had retreated with her knitting, and asked if he might speak with her. "Of course, Mr. Ashford," she said, gesturing to the chair opposite. "Please sit." He did so, his expression troubled. "Miss Marple, I owe you an apology. I have been churlish and resentful, and I allowed my bitterness to blind me to the real danger in this house. If you had not been here, if you had not acted when you did, my stepmother would be dead, and I would have to live with the knowledge that I did nothing to prevent it." "You have apologized to Mrs. Ashford, I hope?" Miss Marple asked. "I have tried," Philip said. "Dr. Hargrave allowed me to see her briefly this morning. She was kind, far kinder than I deserved. She told me she understood my anger, that she had never sought to replace my mother, and that she hoped in time we might find a way to be family." His voice broke slightly. "I do not deserve her forgiveness, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to earn it." "Then you have made the first step toward becoming the man your father hoped you would be," Miss Marple said. "Do not underestimate the power of that, Mr. Ashford." He nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears, and after a moment he rose and took his leave. Miss Marple watched him go and allowed herself a small, hopeful smile. Perhaps some good would come of this tragedy after all. That afternoon Miss Marple spoke with Clara Finch, who was packing her belongings in preparation to leave Maplewood. The young woman's face was pale but resolute. "I cannot stay, Miss Marple," she said. "I have been a burden to Cousin Lavinia for too long. It is time I stood on my own feet." "That is admirable," Miss Marple said. "But do not be too hasty, my dear. Mrs. Ashford will need friends around her in the coming weeks, and I suspect she would welcome your company." Clara shook her head. "You are kind, but I must find employment, must learn to support myself. I have been dependent on charity for too long, and it has made me weak and fearful. I wish to be strong, Miss Marple. Strong like you." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "I am not strong, my dear. I am simply observant, and I have lived long enough to recognize patterns in human behavior. But I believe you have more strength than you realize, Miss Finch. You have survived hardship, and you have remained kind despite your fear. That is a form of courage." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I shall remember your words." Later, Miss Marple sought out Dr. Hargrave, whom she found sitting beside Lavinia's door, keeping his vigil. "Dr. Hargrave," as she said, "might I have a word?" He stood, stretching his stiff limbs. "Of course." They walked to the library, and Miss Marple closed the door behind them. "Doctor, I know you have loved Mrs. Ashford for many years." He did not deny it. "I have, since we were young. But she loved Edmund, and I would never have come between them. After he died, I hoped. But then Gerald appeared, and she was swept away. I have tried to be content with friendship, Miss Marple, but it has not been easy. And now?" Miss Marple asked gently. He sighed. "Now she is free of Gerald, but she is also deeply wounded. I do not know if she will ever trust another man again, and I cannot blame her. I will remain her friend, Miss Marple, for as long as she will have me." "That will have to be enough, perhaps," Miss Marple said. "Or perhaps in time, when her wounds have healed, she will see what has been before her all along, a man who has loved her faithfully and without condition. Do not lose hope, Dr. Hargrave." He smiled, though it was a sad, wistful thing. "You are an incurable romantic, Miss Marple." "I prefer to think of myself as a realist," she replied. "And in my experience, true love, the quiet, steadfast kind, often wins in the end." That evening, as the sun set over Maplewood's gardens, casting long golden shadows across the lawns, Miss Marple took a final walk through the grounds. She found old Tom by the roses, pruning as always, and they spoke of the events of the past days. "It's a terrible business, Miss Marple," he said, shaking his head. "I never thought I'd see the day when murder was attempted at Maplewood." "But you stopped it, ma'am, and for that we're all grateful." "I simply did what was necessary," Miss Marple said. "But tell me, Tom, will the garden survive this? Will Maplewood?" The old man looked around, his weathered face thoughtful. "Gardens are resilient, Miss Marple. They weather storms and droughts and all manner of troubles, and they come back stronger than before. I reckon Maplewood will do the same, given time." Miss Marple smiled. "I believe you are right." As she returned to the house, she encountered Inspector Craddock, who was preparing to leave. "I shall be in touch, Miss Marple," he said. "We may need you to testify at the trial." "I shall be available," she assured him. "And, Inspector, what will happen to Mr. Ashford?" "If convicted, he will likely face life imprisonment," Craddock said. "Attempted murder is a serious charge, and with the evidence we have, conviction is all but certain." Miss Marple nodded. "Justice, then, will be served." "Thanks to you," the inspector said, tipping his hat. "Good evening, Miss Marple." As he drove away, Miss Marple stood in the entrance hall and looked around at the portraits, the polished wood, the grand staircase. Maplewood Manor had been the scene of greed and betrayal, of theft and attempted murder. But it had also been the scene of courage and loyalty, of friendship and love. And as old Tom had said, it would survive. It would endure. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had learned that greed and fear often wore the same face, and at Maplewood, she suspected, both had walked freely through these halls. Chapter 7. The Truth Emerges. 3 days after Gerald Ashford's arrest, a semblance of calm had begun to return to Maplewood Manor, though it was a fragile, tentative thing, like a convalescent taking their first uncertain steps. Lavinia had emerged from her rooms at last, pale and subdued but determined to reclaim her life. Dr. Hargrave remained close, his presence a quiet reassurance, and Philip had taken it upon himself to manage the day-to-day affairs of the estate, freeing his stepmother from the burden of decisions and responsibilities. Inspector Craddock had completed his investigation and departed, leaving behind a detailed report that would form the basis of the prosecution's case against Gerald. The evidence was damning: the poisoned milk, the burned letters, the testimony of the household staff, and, most tellingly, Gerald's own partial confession. Yet for all that, Miss Marple sensed that the full truth had not yet been revealed, that there were layers beneath the surface that had yet to be peeled back. It was for this reason that she requested a gathering in the drawing-room on the afternoon of the third day. She had spoken with Inspector Craddock, and he had agreed to attend, curious to hear what the elderly lady had to say. Lavinia, though reluctant at first, consented to be present, as did Philip, Clara, Dr. Hargrave, and Mrs. Brennan. Even Mr. Dunley, who had been preparing to leave, was persuaded to stay for the occasion. They assembled at 3 o'clock. The room bathed in the soft, golden light of late afternoon. A fire crackled in the hearth, and tea had been laid out, though no one seemed inclined to touch it. Miss Marple sat in her accustomed chair, her knitting in her lap, and waited until everyone was settled before she began. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice calm and measured. "I know this has been a dreadful ordeal for you all, and I do not wish to prolong your distress. But I believe it is important that we understand not only what happened, but why, and to ensure that there are no lingering shadows over this household. Inspector Craddock, seated near the door, nodded. Miss Marple has been of invaluable assistance to this investigation, and I am eager to hear what she has to say. Miss Marple inclined her head in acknowledgment. Let us begin, then, with Mr. Gerald Ashford. He has been arrested and charged with the attempted murder of his wife, and the evidence against him is overwhelming. But what led him to such an act? Greed, certainly. He married Mrs. Ashford for her money, and when he discovered she was planning to divorce him and disinherit him, he saw his comfortable life slipping away. But I believe there was more to it than simple avarice. She paused, her gaze moving around the room. Mr. Ashford was not merely greedy, he was desperate. His business ventures, we have learned, were failures, and he was deeply in debt. He had married Mrs. Ashford, believing he had secured his future, only to discover that she was not as easily controlled as he had hoped. When she began to assert her independence, to question his management of the estate, and finally to consult her solicitor, he realized that he was about to lose everything. And so he decided to act. But why the theft? Philip asked, his brow furrowed. Why go through her letters, her correspondence? Why not simply do what he planned to do? Because he needed to be certain, Miss Marple said. He needed to know the full extent of her plans, and he needed to destroy any evidence that might implicate him after her death. If she had died suddenly, and her solicitor had come forward with proof that she had been planning a divorce, suspicion would naturally have fallen on Mr. Ashford. So he searched for her letters, and when he found them, he burned them. But even then, he could not be certain he had found everything. Hence the ransacking of her sitting room, a final, desperate attempt to ensure that no evidence remained. And the thefts from the other members of the household? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why search my letters? Miss Marple turned to her. Because, my dear, he was attempting to isolate Mrs. Ashford. By reading your correspondence, he learned of your financial difficulties and your dependence on Mrs. Ashford's charity. He hoped to find something, some letter or plea, that might be used to turn Mrs. Ashford against you, to make her doubt your motives and push you away. If he could convince her that everyone around her was self-serving and untrustworthy, she would have no one to turn to but him. It was a calculated strategy and a cruel one. Clara's face crumpled, and Dr. Hargrave reached over to pat her hand gently. But there is another aspect to this case that has troubled me, Miss Marple continued, and that is the question of Mr. Dunley. All eyes turned to the American, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Now see here, Miss Marple, I've already explained. I know what you have explained, Mr. Dunley, Miss Marple said mildly. You were hired by Mr. Philip Ashford to investigate Mr. Gerald's activities, and you were photographing the paintings as part of that investigation. But I wonder, was that the full extent of your involvement? Dunley's face flushed. What are you implying? I am implying nothing, Miss Marple said. I am simply asking. You are a private investigator, Mr. Dunley, and presumably a competent one. Did you learn anything about Mr. Gerald that you did not share with Mr. Philip, or with the police? There was a long silence. Dunley glanced at Inspector Craddock, then back at Miss Marple, and finally he sighed. All right, he said. Yes, I learned something. I discovered that Gerald Ashford had been in contact with a London art dealer, a man of dubious reputation, about selling several of the manor's paintings. He was planning to claim they were his to sell, and to pocket the proceeds. I was gathering evidence of this when all hell broke loose with the poisoning. I reported it to the inspector yesterday, Craddock nodded. That is correct. We are investigating the matter, and if Mr. Ashford was indeed planning to defraud Mrs. Ashford, additional charges will be brought. Philip's face darkened. He was going to sell our paintings? My father's collection? It would appear so, Miss Marple said, which brings us to the question of motive. Mr. Ashford was not only facing the loss of his position as Mrs. Ashford's husband, he was facing financial ruin and potential criminal prosecution. He had gambled everything on this marriage, and when it began to fall apart, he saw only one way out, to ensure that Mrs. Ashford did not live to divorce him or expose his crimes. Lavinia, who had been silent throughout, spoke now, her voice trembling. I was such a fool, Jane. I saw only what I wished to see, a charming man who seemed to care for me. I ignored the signs, the warnings. I nearly paid for that folly with my life. You were not a fool, Miss Marple said gently. You were lonely, and you trusted. Those are not failings, my dear. They are signs of a generous heart. The fault lies with Mr. Ashford, not with you. Dr. Hargrave cleared his throat. Miss Marple, may I ask, how did you know to act when you did? What made you certain that Gerald would attempt to poison Lavinia that particular night? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I did not know for certain, Doctor, but I had observed several things that suggested the moment was imminent. First, Mrs. Ashford had informed me earlier that day that she intended to meet with her solicitor the following morning to finalize the divorce proceedings. If Mr. Ashford had somehow learned of this, perhaps by overhearing a telephone conversation or intercepting a letter, he would have known he had very little time left to act. Second, I had noted that he had been unusually attentive to Mrs. Ashford that evening, insisting on dining with her, on seeing to her comfort. It was the behavior of a man saying a final goodbye, or preparing to commit a terrible act. And third, when I spoke with Bessie earlier in the day, she mentioned that Mr. Ashford had told her he would deliver the nightcap himself that evening, as she had too much to do. That struck me as highly suspicious, for Bessie is a diligent girl, and I could not imagine what additional duties she might have had. So you stayed awake and kept watch, Philip said, his voice filled with admiration. And you saved her life. I did what was necessary, Miss Marple said simply, and I was fortunate that Mrs. Ashford trusted me enough to heed my warning. Inspector Craddock rose to his feet. Well, Miss Marple, I believe you have laid out the case with admirable clarity. Mr. Gerald Ashford acted out of greed and desperation, and but for your intervention, he would have succeeded in his plan. The Crown will be pursuing the fullest possible charges against him, and I am confident he will spend the rest of his life in prison. Justice, Lavinia murmured. At last, yes, Miss Marple said. Justice. But also, I hope, a new beginning for you, Mrs. Ashford. You have been given a second chance, my dear. Do not waste it in fear or regret. Lavinia met her eyes, and for the first time in days, a genuine smile touched her lips. I will not, Jane. I promise you that. As the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple remained by the fire, her knitting in her lap. Philip approached her, his expression earnest. Miss Marple, I want you to know I will do everything in my power to make amends, to be worthy of my father's legacy and of Lavinia's forgiveness. I believe you will, Mr. Ashford, Miss Marple said warmly. And I think your father would be proud. He nodded, his eyes bright, and left the room. Dr. Hargrave lingered a moment longer. Miss Marple, he said, you spoke earlier of new beginnings. Do you truly believe Lavinia can recover from this? I do, Miss Marple said. She is stronger than she knows, Dr. Hargrave, and she has friends who love her. That is a powerful foundation for healing. And what of other possibilities? He asked hesitantly. Do you think she might in time be open to... Miss Marple smiled. Patience, Dr. Hargrave. Give her time to heal, to rediscover herself. And then, when the moment is right, tell her what is in your heart. I suspect you will find her more receptive than you imagine. He blushed, but his smile was hopeful. Thank you, Miss Marple, for everything. As he left, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her expression serene. The truth had been revealed, justice had been served, and Maplewood Manor could begin to heal. It was, she reflected, the best one could hope for in a world where human nature was so often frail and flawed. As Inspector Craddock led Gerald Ashford away in handcuffs, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, reflecting that the most dangerous villains were often those who smiled the brightest and feared the most. Chapter 8. Reflections at Maplewood. A week had passed since the terrible night when Gerald Ashford's plot had been thwarted, and Maplewood Manor, though still bearing the scars of recent events, had begun to breathe again. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the house like a shroud had lifted, replaced by a cautious, tentative hope. Miss Marple, who had intended to remain only a fortnight, found herself lingering a few days longer, reluctant to leave her friend until she was certain Lavinia was truly on the path to recovery. The weather had turned fine, the autumn sun bathing the gardens in a warm, golden light that seemed to coax the flowers into one last burst of color before winter's arrival. Miss Marple spent much of her time outdoors, walking the familiar paths, sitting on the bench by the lily pond, and observing the life of the manor as it slowly returned to normal. Lavinia had emerged from her rooms fully now, and though there were shadows beneath her eyes and a new gravity to her manner, there was also a quiet strength that had not been there before. She had met with her solicitor, Mr. Pemberton, who had traveled from London to discuss the dissolution of her marriage to Gerald and the restoration of her will to its original terms, leaving the bulk of her estate to Philip with generous bequests to the staff. She had also, with Philip's full support, begun to make plans for the future of Maplewood, plans that involved opening the gardens to the public on certain days, hosting literary and historical events, and ensuring that the manor remained a living part of the community rather than a museum piece. "I want this house to be filled with life again," she told Miss Marple one afternoon, as they sat in the drawing-room, tea between them. "I want laughter and conversation, visitors and friends. I have spent too long allowing fear and secrecy to govern my existence." "No more! That is a splendid plan," Miss Marple said warmly, "and I think it will bring you great joy, my dear." Philip, too, had undergone a transformation. The sullen, resentful young man Miss Marple had first encountered had been replaced by someone earnest and determined, someone who had finally understood the value of family and responsibility. He had taken charge of the estate's management with a zeal that surprised even himself, consulting with old Tom about the gardens, with Mrs. Brennan about the household, and with Lavinia about every major decision. The relationship between stepmother and stepson, so long fractured, was slowly mending, and Miss Marple took great satisfaction in witnessing it. One morning, as she walked through the rose garden, she found Philip there, pruning the bushes under old Tom's watchful eye. "Good morning, Mr. Ashford," she said with a smile. "I see you have taken up gardening." He straightened, wiping his brow, and grinned. "Old Tom is teaching me. He says a man who cares for a garden learns patience and humility." "I suspect I need both." "We all do," Miss Marple said. "And I think your father would be very pleased to see you here, working the land he loved." Philip's expression grew thoughtful. "I've been thinking a great deal about my father, Miss Marple, about the kind of man he was and the kind of man I want to be. I wasted so much time being angry, being bitter, when I could have been learning from him, honoring his memory. I can't change the past, but I can shape the future." "That is all any of us can do," Miss Marple said. "And I believe you are shaping it well." She continued her walk, pausing to admire the dahlias and asters that bloomed in profusion along the borders. Old Tom, catching up with her, tipped his cap. "He's a good lad, that Mr. Philip," he said. "Just needed to find his way is all. Maplewood's lucky to have him." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "And Maplewood is lucky to have you, Tom. Your loyalty and dedication have been unwavering." The old man blushed with pleasure. "It's my home, Miss Marple. Always has been. I'll tend these gardens till the day I die, God willing." "I am certain you will," Miss Marple said, patting his arm. Clara Finch had indeed departed, though not before a tearful farewell with Lavinia. She had secured a position as a companion to an elderly lady in Bath, a respectable situation that offered her both employment and independence. Before she left, she had sought out Miss Marple to thank her. "You gave me courage, Miss Marple," she said, her eyes bright with tears. "You showed me that I did not have to live in fear, that I could stand on my own. I shall never forget your kindness." "You had that courage within you all along, my dear," Miss Marple said. "You simply needed the opportunity to discover it. I wish you every happiness." Dr. Hargrave remained a frequent visitor to Maplewood, though his visits now had a different quality to them. He no longer hovered anxiously over Lavinia, but instead engaged her in conversation, made her laugh, and accompanied her on long walks through the grounds. Miss Marple observed this with quiet satisfaction, noting the way Lavinia's face softened when he entered a room, the way his eyes followed her with a tenderness that spoke of years of patient devotion. One afternoon, as Miss Marple sat on the terrace, Dr. Hargrave joined her, settling into the chair beside hers with a sigh of contentment. "It is a beautiful day," he said. "Indeed it is," Miss Marple agreed. "And how is Mrs. Ashford?" "She is well," he said, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "More than well, in fact. She is beginning to laugh again, Miss Marple, and to speak of the future with hope rather than dread." "It is a transformation. And what of your own future, Dr. Hargrave?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Have you given any thought to it?" He met her gaze, his expression both hopeful and uncertain. "I have, Miss Marple. I care for Lavinia deeply, more deeply than I can say. but I am afraid to speak of it, afraid to burden her with my feelings when she has only just escaped a nightmare." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "you underestimate her resilience. And perhaps you underestimate the power of being loved by someone who asks nothing in return save the privilege of caring. Speak to her, Doctor. When the moment is right, tell her what is in your heart. I suspect you will find her more receptive than you fear." He nodded slowly, his smile growing. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I shall take your advice." As he left, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her needles clicking in a steady, soothing rhythm. She thought of all the people she had encountered at Maplewood, the wounded, the bitter, the frightened, the greedy, and how each, in their own way, had been shaped by the events of these past weeks. Some, like Gerald, had been broken by their own choices. Others, like Lavinia and Philip, had found strength and redemption. It was, she reflected, the eternal dance of human nature, the capacity for both darkness and light, for cruelty and kindness. Mr. Dunley had departed the day after the gathering. His investigation concluded, and his services no longer required. Before he left, he had sought out Miss Marple to express his admiration. "You're quite something, Miss Marple," he said, shaking her hand vigorously. "I've been in this business for 20 years, and I've never seen anyone piece together a case the way you did. Ever thought of going professional?" Miss Marple chuckled. "I am quite content with my knitting and my garden, Mr. Dunley, but I thank you for the compliment." He laughed and tipped his hat. "Well, if you ever change your mind, look me up. I could use a partner like you." As his car disappeared down the drive, Miss Marple shook her head with amusement. Professional detective work, indeed. She much preferred her quiet life in St. Mary Mead, where the mysteries were smaller, the stakes less dire, and the tea always hot. On her final evening at Maplewood, Lavinia hosted a small dinner, just Miss Marple, Philip, and Dr. Hargrave. It was a quiet, intimate affair filled with good food, gentle conversation, and the sense that, at last, the worst had passed. After the meal, Lavinia drew Miss Marple aside, taking her hands in hers. "Jane," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I cannot thank you enough for what you have done. You saved my life, you brought justice to this house, and you have given me the courage to reclaim my future. I shall be forever in your debt." "You owe me nothing, my dear," Miss Marple said. "I am simply glad I was here when you needed me. But you must promise me something." "Anything. Promise me you will be happy, Lavinia. Promise me you will live fully, love deeply, and never again allow fear to govern your choices." Lavinia's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "I promise, Jane. I promise." The next morning Miss Marple prepared to depart. Her bags were packed, and a car had been arranged to take her to the station. As she descended the grand staircase one last time, she paused to look around at the portraits, the polished wood, the familiar beauty of Maplewood Manor. It had been the scene of great darkness, but also of great courage, and it would endure, she was certain, as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Lavinia, Philip, Dr. Hargrave, Mrs. Brennan, Bessie, and old Tom gathered in the entrance hall to bid her farewell. There were tears and embraces, promises to write, and invitations to return. "You will always have a home here, Miss Marple," Lavinia said. "Always. And you will always have a friend in me," Miss Marple replied. As the car pulled away from Maplewood, Miss Marple turned to gaze back at the manor, its windows glowing in the morning sun. She thought of all that had happened there, the theft, the fear, the attempted murder, and finally the justice and healing that had followed. She thought of Gerald Ashford, now awaiting trial, and of the choices that had led him to ruin. And she thought, as she so often did, of the complex, contradictory, endlessly fascinating nature of humanity. People, she murmured to herself, are capable of such terrible things, but they are also capable of such goodness. One must never forget that. The train journey back to St. Mary Mead was peaceful, the English countryside rolling past in a tapestry of green and gold. Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting in her lap, and allowed herself to relax. Another mystery solved, another household set to rights. It was, she thought, a satisfying conclusion, though she suspected there would be more mysteries to come. There always were, after all, wherever human beings gathered. As the train pulled into St. Mary Mead Station, Miss Marple gathered her belongings and prepared to disembark. The village looked just as it always had, quiet, charming, and deceptively peaceful. She smiled to herself, already looking forward to a cup of tea in her own parlor, a chat with her neighbors, and the familiar rhythm of her daily life, but she would not forget Maplewood, nor Lavinia, nor the lessons learned there. She would carry them with her as she carried all her experiences, adding them to the vast store of knowledge she had accumulated over a lifetime of observation. And so, as the English countryside rolled past her window, Miss Marple tucked away another tale of wealth and wickedness, of secrets kept and truths uncovered, knowing that wherever she went, human nature remained her most faithful and most tragic companion. Candlelight Mysteries. And so, dear listener, Murder at Maplewood Manor draws to its quiet close, the candle's flame steady once more, its light falling softly on truth revealed. In the days and months that followed, Maplewood Manor began its true healing. Gerald Ashford stood trial and was convicted of attempted murder, sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. The evidence against him, the poisoned milk, the burned letters, the testimony of those he had sought to manipulate, proved overwhelming, and justice, as Miss Marple had promised, was served. Lavinia Ashford, freed at last from fear and deceit, reclaimed her life with a grace and determination that inspired all who knew her. She opened Maplewood's gardens to the public, transforming the manor into a place of beauty and community. And in time, with patience and gentle encouragement, she allowed Dr. James Hargrave to speak the words he had carried in his heart for so many years. Their engagement was announced the following spring, a union built not on passion and haste, but on friendship, trust, and a love that had quietly endured. Philip Ashford proved himself a worthy steward of his father's legacy, managing the estate with diligence and care, and building a relationship with Lavinia that honored the man who had loved them both. Clara Finch found her footing in the world, and though her path was not easy, she walked it with courage, and in St. Mary Mead, Miss Jane Marple returned to her knitting, her garden, and the gentle rhythm of village life, each stitch a reflection on the tangled hearts of humankind, on the darkness that dwells within, and the light that, with patience and wisdom, can be coaxed forth. Until next time, dear listener. Another Secret Fades by Candlelight